Broken, racist, inadequate. Just some of the language used to describe primary school staffing.
Provisional NCEA results show a sharp decline in Level 1 attainment.
It is a national shame that 54% of our kids haven't been attending school regularly.
50,000 teachers have staged one of the biggest ever strikes in New Zealand.
New Zealand's education system is a mess, riddled with unscientific ideas, and it's fallen from a system of excellence that it once was. So how do you fix this sort of thing?
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detailed today, the state of our education in New Zealand. If it received a report card right now, what would the grade be? Would it pass or fail?
Oh, that's such a mean question. I should have seen that coming. That's
John Gerritsen, RNZ's education correspondent, who's been covering every aspect of education for much longer than the 13 years of standard schooling. We'll have his full answer to the great question a little later. We'll also look at the NCEA changes, the return of charter schools, low school attendance, the school lunches fallout and the teacher shortages. But first, is the coalition government right now doing enough to get our education system back on track and trying new workable options?
Look, they are, and there's a real determination there just to get on and get things done. I know last year was a year like no other as education reporter, not just with schools but also tertiary and early childhood. There was more going on than I could keep up with. It was a frantic year, and I was just reporting on it. I wasn't doing it. So, there's a real willingness to try things, and the government's kind of looked at a few issues around, for example, maths teaching and the teaching of reading and writing and said, right, this is the right way to go, we're doing it.
The government announced several of their big education policies as part of their first 100-day plan.
We will mandate the basics of maths, reading and writing in our schools.
Come budget time, Erica Stanford outlined her vision for how schools will teach literacy.
And that starts with teaching the basics brilliantly, with this investment into structured literacy.
Children will be learning maths based on a new world-leading, knowledge-rich maths curriculum based on the best from across the OECD, like Singapore and Australia, and adapted for New Zealand.
Forget the consultation, as it were. We're just going to go ahead, and whether it's going to be the right thing remains to be seen. You'll see in a few more years' time. But they're certainly getting on and trying to make things happen.
This includes the reintroduction of charter schools announced last year and made a reality this month.
First of our new charter schools are opening their doors and welcoming students for the start of the academic year. The controversial concept was reintroduced by the government in 2024.
Charter schools are government-funded but privately run. This month alone, 7 have opened across the country in a bid to improve overall educational achievement, particularly for students who have been underperforming or disengaged from the traditional education system.
Learning looks a bit different here. Auckland's Northwest College, one of 7 new charter schools, ready for action in Term 1.
What are the benefits of charter schools?
Well, they say they've got more flexibility with their funding, so they're able to hire different types of staff, for example. So not just teachers, they may have other support staff. Last time around, it was hard to see much, innovation in the schools in terms of the way they teach. Certainly state schools weren't rushing to copy anything they were doing, and there wasn't really any independent verification that, they were achieving better results. They were reporting good results, but no one was actually checking to say, those results are actually correct and their students, given their backgrounds, are actually performing better. That was very, very weak evidence. So they really, need that sort of evidence before they can win the sort of a confidence of the rest of the education system, and that's really been lacking.
What about for Māori and Pacifica students, and also for students who have sort of special educational needs? Do they better cater for these people?
There wasn't any independent evidence of that last time around. So this time around, it's quite interesting who's setting up shop here. There are a couple of schools that are specifically aimed at disengaged and struggling students. A couple from Australia, which is really interesting. We haven't had foreign operators here before. One of them's aimed at sort of primary school, intermediate age children with dyslexia and learning difficulties, and others aimed at disengaged students. And then there's another that a group of Christchurch schools have set up to cater for disengaged teens, that's a really interesting model that a group of state schools has decided, okay, instead of using alternative education programs and so forth, we're going to set up our own school. And when I was talking about that with a secondary principal, he thought, that's a really good idea. Wish I'd thought of it. So it may be that other schools might copy that. Who knows?
This was obviously brought back particularly by David Seymour. Is there a concern if, the coalition government goes out, Labor comes back in, that these will once again be disestablished?
Yep, I think that would be almost certain.
My response to that is that Labor has got rid of these before and we will get rid of them again because they are bad for young people and bad for their learning.
I understand the way the charter school contracts have been set up this time around would make that difficult. Last time around, the charter schools were allowed to continue as state schools, as special character or integrated schools, which meant that their teachers were put on the payroll of the Education Ministry, and their funding would come to them, through operations grant and so forth. So yeah, very likely they'd be changed or disestablished in some way should there be a change of government.
We've had massive interest, huge numbers of people that want to run charters.
You've got 7 that we've opened this month. Has there been good enrolments for it? What's the sort of support that they've had for these 7 that have already just opened?
Yeah, really mixed. Some of them have been a bit cagey and said, yes, we plan to open with 45 or however many. It's sort of hard to know. A couple of them have said they're just starting with 15 students, for example. I think there's a French language school opening in Auckland. They're starting with 6, but they've got quite a few more, 5-year-olds due to start through the year. Low numbers. When you think about primary schools, in Auckland running to, hundreds and hundreds of students, they're starting small, but, they probably want to start small because, you get all your systems in place. You wouldn't want to necessarily start a brand new school with 300 kids on day one. It could be a bit much.
What do you think the opposition is, just from your mainstream people and mainstream parents and stuff? What is the opposition to charter schools?
Well, first of all, you've got a system where people can make a profit from the state funding. So you could get into situations where they're running a school and then they're creaming off a certain amount, a small percentage as profit. And if you look at the early childhood sector, there's a lot of criticism from some teachers about that actually these are being run as businesses rather than in the best interests of children. Also, that it's a way of undermining teacher unions, and there is concern that charter schools would eventually go down the same route as some charter schools in the States and be hiring a lot of young, cheap teachers to save on the salary bill. So those are some of the criticisms. At this stage, and we don't know how it's going to play out, some state schools may want to become charter schools. At this stage, it is a pretty sort of niche offering with relatively small numbers of students, but that could all change if larger state schools choose to convert to charter school status.
Are charter school teachers sort of held to the same accountability standards as public school teachers?
Well, they're also subject to the Teaching Council.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, if you're a registered teacher, there can be, complaints about you and so forth, and you've got to meet teaching standards. But, charter schools have more freedom in who they hire, but generally they will hire registered teachers to be teachers, so they tend not to hire unqualified people to be teachers.
David Seymour's charter school staff are costing far more than your average public servant. 3 News has obtained information showing the average salary at his charter school agency is over $150,000, more than 50% higher than the average across the public service.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, whether they do attract more teachers because of higher pay rates, but they're a pretty niche offering. There's only 7 so far, and the number of students they have is quite low. So, it's hard to see them making much of an impact at this stage.
The teacher staffing situation is right now dire in New Zealand. As kids settle back into school, educators are seriously worried about a lack of teachers, with a shortage of about 350 full-timers.
More than $50 million is being pumped into our education sector as the government hopes to recruit and train 1,500 teachers.
In recent years, classes have had to be cancelled due to a lack of specialised teachers.
There are so few teachers, schools have started nicking them off their neighbours, creating a bit of a teacher merry-go-round.
If I take a teacher from another school, it might solve my immediate problem, but then there's still a vacancy in the school up the road.
The shortage is about as bad as it gets.
Why is there a teacher shortage in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, look, if you talk to teachers and principals about it, one of the big things is pay, but also just that general esteem that teachers are held in and the difficulty of the job. People perhaps don't respect teachers as much as they used to, and you also hear from new teachers in particular just how tough the job is, and it puts people off. A lot of people will go into their first year or two of teaching and decide it's just too hard and leave. So, that those things are all contributing to the shortage, and the number of people training to be teachers, particularly secondary teachers, has fallen a lot over the last few years, and there's real efforts to try and pull that back up, but it's sort of hard to see how much success you're going to have until some of those other things change.
And what's the flow-on effect from that? I mean, how does this impact, say, student learning?
Well, I've talked to principals, secondary principals, and over the last few years who have said we are hiring teachers we would not normally hire. So, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel sometimes. And that's not to say all teachers they're hiring are in that situation. That's not the case at all. But, there are some teachers who are being hired who wouldn't normally get a job. In the last round of PISA tests, that conclusion there was that a quarter of New Zealand students were in schools where the principal had said they had inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff. And that was up from 16% in the previous round of testing. So quite a big increase in principals saying, some of our staff aren't that good.
That's a worry.
That's a worry. But again, you might be talking out of a staff of, many, 40, 50, one teacher. We don't know how widespread that is.
And are some teachers sort of coming out of retirement? Are we getting a lot of older teachers to try and fill those gaps?
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. There's been a big increase in the number of teachers over the age of 65.
Just how many? Well, a report released about 18 months ago revealed the exact numbers. It's surprising.
There was 7,500 teachers over the age of 65, and over 700 of them were 75 or older. So there's been a big increase. And what's happening is you've got, in particular, secondary schools saying, we can't find a maths teacher for all our classes. Can we persuade so-and-so who used to teach here just to come back for, a day a week or something like that? And there's a fair bit of that been going on. And also people who don't have a teaching qualification sort of dragged in to teach. That's under something called a limited authority to teach. Now, there's nearly 2,000 people with that limited authority to teach at the end of 2023. That's double the figure in 2019. So you can see that schools are really having to go to great lengths to get enough teachers.
Is it any wonder then, John, that kids are failing to turn up to school when that's what they're being faced with? Because we have a real attendance problem, it seems, at the moment.
Yeah, look, I don't know that you could blame attendance on teachers, although I did have a good conversation with a West Coast principal who said their strategy to good attendance was to make school the best party in town, where you wanted to come every day. But, New Zealand definitely has a big attendance problem.
New Zealand has the worst school attendance when compared to our neighbours and friends, Australia, the UK, even the United States. The government is calling it a truancy crisis.
And a lot of it's just around attitude, parental attitude that, it's okay to miss a couple of days. If you look at somewhere like England, which has 90%, I think, regular attendance, whereas we're sort of around 60% or 50%, those sort of figures depending on the term. So there's a lot of ground to make up there, and there's pretty clear evidence that if kids just turn up to school, they'll do better. So a lot of these achievement problems where children aren't doing very well in maths and English and science, well, they won't go away, but they'll certainly improve if children are just at school a lot more.
So, bar having the party in the West Coast, what's been done to get the kids back at school more often?
In New Zealand, around 50% of school students regularly miss class. The country's coalition government is hoping a new tracking tool can help clamp down on this nationwide crisis.
Well, the government has set a goal that by 2030, we will have 80% of students attending 90% of the time.
A lot of it's messaging to parents. There's real encouragement to parents to get their kids along to school. There's been a bit of an overhaul of the attendance service so that in many cases, schools have a lot more direct control over chasing up parents and families and saying, okay, where's your child? What are the gaps to getting your child back to school? There's a whole lot going on there. People would say actually the school lunch program helps, although some of the evidence around that can be a bit weak.
And of course, the school lunch program has been off to a bumpy start this year.
School staff are spending hundreds of dollars of their own money on pizza, fruit and muesli bars to feed students left hungry as the government's free school lunch program hits snags in its first week.
You just touched on school lunches. How problematic is that going to be for the government and also for schools?
Yeah, look, the early signs are that there's been a lot of teething troubles with deliveries and also the quality of the food. I've talked to principals about this, and some are just furious. They say that the lunches have made a huge difference, and this whole idea that, well, why are we giving kids a flash hot lunch? We should just give them the sort of lunch that any other parents would give their kids to go to school. They say, well, that's not really a valid argument, because the kids we're trying to help might not get any food that day, or the lunch will be the best meal they have all day. So that is one that's going to roll on, and it's going to be interesting to see, by the middle of the year, whether the criticism of the changes to the scheme has died down or keeping on going.
Now, what about the criticism of NCEA Level 1 in particular, following recent changes to the qualification, including a new credit system, fewer larger achievement standards and different methods of assessment?
One of the interesting issues that's going to come up this year, we're talking about NCEA, is these literacy and numeracy tests that young people must pass before they can get any NCEA certificates. And you look, last year there was 2 rounds of these tests, and kids can have multiple attempts. After those 2 rounds of sort of 100,000 kids had a go, the pass rates were 70% in reading, 66% in writing, and 55% in numeracy. So out of that, you've got about 40,000 young people who tried to pass those tests. They failed at least one. They can't get an NCEA certificate. How this plays out over the next few years is going to be critical, because you've got to get across the line or you don't get an NCEA certificate. Some young people will get passed on their 3rd try. Others will have to have a go at the alternative, which is to complete 20 credits in specific standards, in the old-fashioned way. But that's a lot of work for kids. It's 20 credits, and it doesn't count towards your NCEA total of 60 credits. So it's more work for young people. A lot of concern about how that's going to roll, especially for kids with dyslexia or kids who are a bit exam phobic or aren't familiar with doing an online test. That's a real pressure point.
Who does that fall on then? For the teacher to up their game? If the kids have got learning disabilities, is it the parents to get more involved? How do you fix that?
Yeah, I don't know, but certainly the government is putting money into extra tuition and assistance at certain schools to try and help more kids get across the line, because the results in particular for schools in low-income areas are very, very poor, the pass rates. So something has to be done about that, and maybe the alternative pathway, rather than which is currently in place just for a few years, maybe that's going to be permanent, and maybe they'll change the way they do that. One thing that's been suggested is, okay, hang on a minute, instead of making this the hurdle you must overcome to get NCEA, maybe it can become a certificate that sits alongside your NCEA certificate. So, yep, you've passed the literacy and numeracy, and you've got NCEA level 1, 2 or 3. Be interesting to see if that suggestion gets any traction.
Is there any real point to level 1 NCEA nowadays? Some schools, it seems, just can't be bothered with it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, because there's been, a few schools, I would almost say grandstanding, saying, oh, level 1's no good, we're going to do something else. And certainly the Education Review Office had a report out last year that said, look, level 1's just been overhauled, it's just been changed to make it more robust. And Aero came out, this hadn't even bedded in, went around schools, said, what do you think? And came to the conclusion that it wasn't working, that it needed another overhaul. But the fact of the matter is that many schools have said, most of our kids don't leave school with just NCEA level 1. They're leaving school with NCEA level 2 or 3. We won't even bother with level 1. We're gonna get kids on the path to get level 2, and that's been driving a lot of the movement away from level 1, rather that concentration on level 2. So if you look at the figures for last year, just 64% of Year 11, so that's Form 5s and old money, did a full Level 1 program. So, you can see there's a lot of schools not even bothering with it. But, there's still some students for whom, Level 1 is the only qualification they get.
The question now begs, is it time to get rid of NCEA and try something new altogether?
When I've talked to teachers about that, there's definitely flaws in NCEA, and there have been attempts to reform it over the years. From what I'm hearing, there's no appetite among schools to get rid of it and replace it, but maybe it does need some bigger changes. Certainly the theory of it is that, instead of passing or failing kids, we should be able to give them credit for what they know. But of course, because you're reducing everything down to accessible standards, young people aren't going to bother with the stuff they're not being assessed on. So the system can be gamed a bit where students might, or schools even, might choose the easier standards for students. So trying to wrestle with those issues has just been an ongoing problem for NCEA. And certainly with the Aero's review of Level 1 and saying that hasn't worked, that really throws a lot of doubt over plans to change NCEA Level 2 and 3. So that may well be back to the drawing board on that one.
John, how does our education system compare to, say, other OECD countries in terms of sort of reading, writing, arithmetic, science and the like?
Yeah, look, there's been so much focus on that over the last few years, hasn't there? And
yeah.
Sort of the gold standard, there's several international tests. Some look at primary school age children, and the big one is PISA, which looks at 15-year-olds. And that's the one that people really focus on, because you're really into your secondary schooling. This is how kids are performing. And it's a pretty sad story. Our results in the PISA test, which look at reading, maths and science, have been steadily trending downwards over the last 20 years or so. Some of the declines have been very minor, but they've still been declines nonetheless. And the last lot of results showed actually quite a big drop in maths, and our science and reading scores also fell a little bit. But as you say, compared to other countries, that's the really key point. How are we doing compared to other countries like Australia and England? Well, we're quite a long way behind. So it's not good, and that's been a source of alarm and concern for a long time. And no one's really come up with a convincing sort of analysis of why that has been happening. There's lots of theories, but it's something that people really want to address.
But are students, do you think, leaving school with the sort of necessary skills for the modern workforce?
You've been hearing that from employers for forever, that students aren't well enough equipped. If you are listening to universities and so forth, they'll say that there's more students coming through who are lacking some of the basic skills. But on the other hand, they've greatly increased their intakes. And so where once upon a time they were only getting 5 or 10% of school leavers, now they're getting 30%. Well, if you're going to be taking 30% of school leavers, you're probably taking in a larger cohort who aren't as well prepared as perhaps in the past.
So what grade does John give our education system?
Look, if you look at the international testing, we're generally above the OECD average, except in maths, and needs to improve, must try harder.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to John Gerritsen. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.